So yeah, I should say that I was not a student of Millard's, and I had heard of Millard and known many people who were students of his. So I'm sort of the next generation, you might say. I benefited from Millard's legacy indirectly by having teachers that he had taught. Um, and then there are other people who, I mean, many of you know Millard very well. I see his son is here. Um, and many of you were friends of his. And Ron Gingrich just walked in the door, who was a student of Millard, and Ron would have his own story to tell. Yesterday, oh, John, and you were a student. So, and then he spoke in this class. Art was. Any other students? So, many of you were students of Millard's. The Millard had. So, I am not qualified to speak as Millard's student. So, I think this is going to have to be a interactive kind of conversation here. We have a microphone to go around, and I ran into Paul Keim providentially at the grocery store yesterday, and I told him about this. Paul Keim was a student of Millard's, and um, Paul had the homily, the meditation at Millard's memorial service. I officiated, and Paul had the meditation. Don't expect that any of you would remember that. I'm trying to recall all the memorial services and funerals that I've done over the time, and I don't always remember what role I had in the service, but I do remember Millard. In one of the earliest stories I had heard about Millard had nothing to do with the Old Testament. It comes from my father-in-law, Marion Bontrager, who taught Bible at Heston College for I don't know how many years, 40 plus, and had Marion would have had Millard as a professor in the back in the old days, the old GBS, Goshen Biblical Seminary days, and it was I think 1960. So this was even before I was born, and Millard comes out of his office, just all excited, jumping up and down, because Bill Mazeroski hit a home run for the Pirates to win the World Series that year. And so when I came here, I think the first or second year I was here, the Mennonite assembly was in Pittsburgh, and I went to a game, and I bought a Bill Mazeroski T-shirt for Millard and brought it back to him. Do you remember that, Matthew? Do you remember that? You still have the shirt, so it's still so that has nothing to do with Old Testament. The paper that Phyllis mentioned is I have here. I actually had a copy that's at home that's got notes on it, and I forgot it at home this morning, so I printed out a clean copy, which doesn't do me much good. How many has anybody? I don't know. Did this go around at all? Was this shared at all, or?
John was just going through his boxes and he read it. And I kind of read it before I handed it off to you. Otherwise,
Yeah. So okay. So this has not gone around, and people have not read this. It's a very interesting paper, and in some ways quite timely. I mean, it's quite dated in a lot of ways, because Mennonite world was different in 1981 than it is now, but also quite timely because he's dealing with issues of how the church relates to the wider world, in terms of, particularly in terms of government, and government power. So I'm going to say a few words that are based in part on my acquaintance with Millard and his work, that I think are particularly relevant for us, interesting for us. And then I'm going to any questions that you might have, and any sort of comments or stories that you might want to tell. Ron is here, but Ron, I'm gonna say some things about our conversation the other day about Millard. So Millard was an Old Testament professor, right? That's Hebrew Bible, and he was a Mennonite. Those are two rather interesting. Those make Millard a very interesting person to begin with, because Mennonites, we tend to have a very conflicted relationship with what we call the Old Testament. It is the violent book of the Bible. There's this sort of vindictive, patriarchal, tribal God, and Jesus came and sort of washed all that away and gave us the gospel of love, right? That's for 20th century Mennonites in particular, maybe not before that, but 20th century Mennonites in particular, that's kind of a very common way of talking about the Old Testament. I hear it as a pastor. I hear it all the time. Even now, I don't know what to do with the Old Testament. What do you do with the book of Joshua and Judges, for example? Like we wrestle with that. So here's Millard, a Mennonite, and very Mennonite. I mean, he's very Mennonite. Like his sensibilities. You read this and like this is a document that's written by a Mennonite Old Testament scholar. Only a Mennonite Old Testament scholar would come up with something like this. It makes it unique. But he loved the Hebrew Bible. He was excited by it and energized by its landscape. So Ron was telling me the other day, we were talking about Millard in anticipation of this, and Ron said, "Well, I think I'll go," and here he is. And Ron said, was an Iowa Mennonite kid, and showed up at seminary and had Millard, and I had no intention of furthering studies in the Old Testament. Why would I, as a Mennonite, why would I want to be an Old Testament scholar? Why would I want to study Old Testament? What's the significance of Old Testament to sort of a peace church community? And so he kind of came with that kind of suspicion, dread maybe of the Old Testament. And Millard opened up the Hebrew Bible for Ron and for many others in ways that they couldn't imagine. Just opened it up like it is not what you think it is. There's so much going on here, and there's a kind of richness. So one of the things that Millard's scholarly approach that shows up in here that really interested him. You could tell this really interested Millard in reading this and in talking to him is what the Hebrew people did with the material that was around them. So he talks a lot, he uses this word NE, which is short for Near Eastern. So no, in the Hebrew Bible, Near Eastern. So he uses the word Near Eastern or NE, not New England, but Near Eastern, for Near Eastern, sort of the ancient Near Eastern. Sometimes it's ANE, the ancient Near Eastern context in which the Hebrew people emerged. And so you read the Hebrew Bible and you see that the Hebrew people are clearly taking material from the cultures around them, right? They're taking the substance, if you will, of the cultures around them. And often people get stuck with that. Particularly people who are not Old Testament scholars looking from the outside, look and say, oh, the Hebrew people just are just regurgitating, if you will, everything that's going on around them in terms of the mythical stories and the sort of the cultural material, the legends, all of these kinds of ethical laws and so on. You say, oh yeah, the people just got this from the Hammurabi. This is the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's from Hammurabi in Babylon. So Millard, I think what really excited Millard was, no, clearly they're using these materials, these cultural materials from what's around them. But what's really interesting is what they're doing with them. they're making those materials their own. They're shaping them in a radically different kind of way. So he talks about that. The Hebrew people are inventing a way of thinking about law and politics and society that was radically new. And thinking about creation, right? And who God is and how God creates and how God relates to human beings. All that's here in this paper. And so he looks at that and he sees there's so much going on here that points, not in a kind of wooden prophetic kind of way, but it points to Jesus, points to the New Testament. And what's so clearly Mennonite about him is that there's this suspicion that Millard has as a Mennonite of what we might call temporal power, the power, in particular, the power of the state. And he sees in the Hebrew Bible this critique of state power, particularly the power of the king, this critique of state power. He sees that. And that's part of his genius as a Mennonite is that he's suspicious of it and the ways that this gets used. And so he uses his word paranesis, that God speaks directly to the people. So in the old ancient Near Eastern sort of way of thinking, the king spoke for God, right? The king was the voice of God. And in the biblical Hebrew framework, who speaks for God? The prophets are the voice of God to the people because God speaks directly to the people through the prophets. Radically different way of thinking about how people relate to God. So he sees this, and he sees it in a really wonderfully Mennonite kind of way. I think. I mean, I see that he's looking at things and he's seen Mennonite. He's seeing things that a Mennonite scholar would see that maybe somebody else wouldn't see. So his legacy is, for me, that he got people excited about the Hebrew Bible and its significance for us and how we live our lives. And so he concludes this paper with asking, what does this say to us, to our community here today, about how we engage the world? And I think in particular, the various kinds of statism that have emerged in our day. The modern nation state is not an ancient phenomenon, right? It's a new. There's a reason it's called the modern nation state. It's a new phenomenon, and our own country is unique in a lot of ways, right? It's an ideologically based kind of nation in many ways, and you have this phenomenon that emerges among others, really, other kinds of statism called Christian nationalism, which is there's it's been talked about a lot. There's a book was a book study, maybe there still is, that's been going on in the library during this hour about Christian nationalism, this kind of statism. And Millard was sort of critiquing that before we had the word Christian nationalism, and we're talking about it like we are today. So those are the kinds of things that Millard was interested in. Like, okay, what are the implications for this? And he would say, in the Hebrew tradition, you didn't have this sort of nationalistic kind of idea, right? The Hebrew Bible itself critiqued that. So what bound people together? How do they think about laws? He's talking about, he talks about what it means to be community in the face of that. The kinds of decisions that we make. He talks about suing people, right? This whole business of people within the church. We shouldn't be suing, we shouldn't be relying on secular courts. We should be solving our own kinds of issues. So that's part of the legacy of the Hebrew Bible for him, not just of Jesus. Any questions? Any questions? And then any stories about Millard, or any testimonies about Millard's legacy that you might have to share. I know there's some Egbert. Let's do this.
This needs to be.
Oh, you want me to
Yeah, because we've got do we have a Zoom?
Yes,
And and it's being recorded, so we want to make sure.
Let's
Just,
Seems to. Yeah, no, it's working.
What puzzles me about your story is why Mennonites are hostile to the Old Testament when the Old Testament was the Bible of Jesus and a major influence on them. I can't understand it.
I have my own answer to that. That answer could get me in trouble. But hey, what do I care at this point in time? So I think that this is gonna work better, isn't it? So I will do this so that you can hear me better. My own answer to that is that I don't think that's always been the case. The hostility to the Old Testament's always been the case among Anabaptists. And if you look at Amish names, and Amos and Levi and on it goes. So clearly within Anabaptist history, there's not been that hostility to the Old Testament. So I think the question is why now? And I think some of it has to do with the influence of a kind of secularism. Like the Old Testament is embarrassing to us in modern times because it seems superstitious, or it seems it is not liberal. I don't mean liberal in the political sense that we tend to use it today, but it's not liberal in the sense of Enlightenment philosophy. The values of and values, oddly, that come from the Old Testament, but we tend to see the conquest stories in Joshua horrify us, and they horrify us, maybe not for reasons that have to do with our non-resistance as Mennonites, but more reasons that have to do with kind of secular embarrassment. They are embarrassing stories. So that's, my sense is that my answer to that question is as Mennonites have assimilated into the wider culture, the Old Testament looks more embarrassing to us, feels more embarrassing. That's my short answer to that question. Ron.
I think maybe another answer to that is that we've been pushed in our direction, our peace position, by other Christian groups. Because other Christian groups, Reformed, Lutheran, Catholic, have often used the Old Testament to justify the military, the things that we would say are contradictory to a peace position. And so it's pushed us to be more rigid. I've understood Millard. Millard totally diverted my life. When I went to seminary, I thought I was going for 1 year and then was going to go on to another grad school in church history. Because I had this sort of what Phil described, this attitude toward the Old Testament, that how well it could be used to support the use of violence. And Millard totally blew me off that track, but he put me in that Old Testament world. As I was, if you know the mystery writer, Louise Penny, she helped me understand Millard. Now, isn't that interesting? And she gave me a whole way of thinking about Millard and how I now look at Scripture, and especially the Old Testament, because Chief Inspector Gamache says that he is an explorer, not a hunter. And I think many of the times we've gone to the Old Testament. I grew up looking at the Old Testament as a hunter. I would go there looking for scriptures that supported the peace position, for example. And when I would find those, then it was like I was really happy, because now I had, as a Mennonite, I probably shouldn't use this word, I had ammunition to use against those who supported violence. But Millard was not doing that. Millard was not hunting for scriptures that supported our position. Rather, Millard was exploring. He was out in the woods seeing what is there and trying to make a sense of the whole forest. And that's what he helped me to come and see and do. And so I went into graduate school in Old Testament, and Millard's probably partly to blame that I didn't finish my doctorate, because he made me into much more an explorer than a hunter. If I would have been a hunter, I would have known that the target was getting my doctor's degree, and I knew exactly how to get there. But I kept getting diverted by exploring the woods and seeing so many fascinating and important things there. So what Phil was saying was Millard looked at Israel in the middle of the ancient world, the ancient Near East, how they took stuff from Babylon and Egypt and the Hittites and used that, but they broke it. They changed it. They made it something different. And I think that it's something that has really shaped me. So I'm glad that he diverted me, and that he taught me how to be an explorer. But even today, I think we have too many hunters and not enough explorers. That's a good start for where I'll leave it.
Thank you, Ron. That's great. Vic, and then Irvin.
I'm glad we have a son here, and I'd like for you to comment on my comment. Millard was very open and friendly with students, even so much as to share some of his graduate school experiences in Pittsburgh. He was employed at Scottdale for less than a princely amount of money and went off then to study for his doctorate under a Jewish person who had converted to Christianity, but who was known as an extremely tough professor. He was nicknamed by his students Little Yahweh. And he told Millard and maybe some others in the class that you're not going to be able to study enough to pass the final exams I'm going to give you. So he intimidated his class, but it just spurred Millard on. And I think at a certain point, he vowed that all he would do is eat, sleep, and study. And it meant that the family, and there were children there at that point, had to make a sacrifice too. Sometimes they would say, couldn't we sometimes just have meat alone instead of just meat as an ingredient with the other vegetables? So there was a certain amount of sacrifice. But as he entered into that scholarship, he entered into it so deeply that when he wrote his book, Yahweh is a Warrior, it was adopted at Harvard Divinity School as a textbook. He was very much respected for his scholarship, and he not only learned Hebrew, he learned the cognate languages so that he could explore some of these other sources that, as you say, Millard used and modified. Now, for a comment or two about what it was like to grow up in that home.
Well, just one comment, and this sort of exemplifies how things. this sort of tells the world that he was in, because he was studying in Pittsburgh and would come home. And one time he went to study in Pittsburgh at the theological seminary there, and he took my mom along and dropped her off at the public library, the Carnegie Library in Pittsburgh, and then got deeply involved with his studies, deeply enough that he forgot that he had brought her there, and came home without her all the way to Scottsdale. And we got this desperate call from my mom wondering where he was. And so I remember my uncle running down the road and saying, go back, pick up your wife. And that sort of exemplifies some of the things that happened in our family.
As Vic mentioned, I think Millard's major book is entitled Yahweh is a Warrior, right? I haven't read the book. I would like to know what he meant by that. I think I can guess, but what did he mean by saying that Yahweh is a warrior? And now in the library, we have a brand new book by Denny Weaver, a current theologian and Bible student of the New Testament, who denies that God requires blood atonement, sacrifice, death of his son, violence, and so on, and says that God is non-resistant. So which is it? Is God a warrior or is God non-resistant? And what does that mean?
I heard somebody say yes. I think that's a really good answer. And I'm going to go with that. To really explore these questions, this would need to be the beginning of like a 15-week series. And I'm unwilling to commit to that myself. Maybe you all can take that up. Those are really big theological sorts of questions. I think it would be good to have somebody respond to the book Yahweh is a Warrior, who might want to engage that a little bit. I will tell one story about Millard's rigor that comes from my conversation with Paul yesterday in the grocery store. Paul said when he showed up at graduate school at Harvard, his very first day, he was late to class, and this was a readings class, and the only chair that was available was right next to the professor. Like, that is not where you want to sit, right? This is not a good thing. And so I forget, Deuteronomy. They were reading Deuteronomy, which has got to be a real thrill to read in a readings class. And there he is sitting next to the professor, and he gets called on, Chaim, you start. And he began reading just like he was trained from Millard. He had no other experience there. This is his first class. And everybody was just sort of blown away. But that's just how he was trained. Like, the students were pushed really, 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 really hard in ways that maybe was exceptionally rigorous. Anyway, that's a story from Paul. Anybody want to speak to Yahweh as a warrior? Just give some thoughts about that. Bert. Phyllis has a mic is coming to you. Phyllis has a mic.
Well, the first answer is that the good. What?
Video.
Oh, the first remark is that that Millard thought that our Lord did the fighting for Israel. Israel didn't have to fight the Egyptians. The Lord sent the flood, and that was that. And he multiplied examples of how, thanks to the Lord's help, Israel won victories without much fighting. He was, I have to admit, totally embarrassed by King David. Didn't know what to do about him. But the rest of it was just how little Israel had to fight in the crucial times. It's like Armageddon. There was no fighting at Armageddon. The Lord's will was done, and that was the end of it.
Yeah. Did you want to say anything, Ron?
I wonder if I could,
No, that's a very good beginning, and I think it, in some ways, it sums it up. But we haven't known what to do with a God who might fight for us. And we think of God as being loving and generous and compassionate. That's an overwhelming part with no other color to God. But all throughout both the Old Testament and I think in the New Testament, there are places where God's called on to be angry and act on our behalf. And if we have a God who gets upset at injustice and violence, I find that very reassuring. But God doesn't say, take my, do your part and stand up and fight for me. And Millard was exactly right, I think. In the Old Testament, it was God. And often, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings are called the former prophets. And especially in Kings, Samuel and Kings, there is enough in there that shows that whoever was putting that together was not overly enthused with some of what David and Solomon did. So there's a real critique of royal hierarchical violence and power. But often, because we take things so literally and we tend to hunt rather than explore, we don't even notice that. So Millard was, I'm sure I know who you were talking about, this professor at Pittsburgh. He was Millard's professor, and Millard wanted me to go to the University of Michigan to study because that's where Dr. David Noel Friedman was. And so I studied with the same person that Millard studied with, and he was rigorous. I couldn't believe it that he called all of us first-year students and said, well, you're meeting at my house on Tuesday night, and we're going to read Hebrew. We're going to read 5 chapters a week. And before that, I think many people thought reading 5 verses a week was doing pretty good. And we would just, and it's like, he said, the only way you learn a language is like, how do you keep a sieve filled with water? You just have to keep pouring it in really fast. And that's the way we learned Hebrew. We just pour it in really fast. But it was this immersion in exploring, in listening to what was being said, not what we thought it was saying, but being quiet enough to let it challenge our presuppositions and assumptions in our previous readings. I don't know if that speaks to the warrior part, but it's a part of that. The warrior is an important part of what God does. And I think, if God's people speak up and say, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I know God is really offended by what's going on right now. And God's really upset, and God's going to do something. The South African song that's meaning so much to me, we will not give up the fight, we have only started. That's what they sang when Mandela was in prison. And it's like, we shall have victory hand holding hand. And it's like, it's not saying we're going to fight violence with violence. But God's going to do something about the arrogance and the violence of those who are imposing that.
That'll preach.
Leonard Gross here. Can I speak?
Leonard Gross.
Pardon?
Yeah, go ahead, Leonard.
Yes. It was stated that David was a problem for Millard. And I have an example for that. Millard spoke to Sojourner's class years ago. It was in the Newcomer Center. And I asked him a question. Did David murder Goliath? Was this a sin? Millard seemed nonplussed. He typically Millard enacted the sling part of the story. You could tell he was entering it full force, but then he hem-hawed around. And Harold Hertzler said, Millard, you are not answering the question. Millard paused for quite a while and then said, he'll need to think about it and he'll get back to us. So that's my little story here.
Thank you. That's great. Those are the words of an explorer, right? I have to think about it and I'll get back to you. John.
Stand. The story of my life with the Mennonite Church, actually, the first brother that I knew was Marcus Lynn. And Marcus was a very rigid and had the answers to everything. And he was a leader of the conference in the Pacific Northwest. I came to Heston and there was Ivan. And Ivan was not quite as dogmatic as Marcus was, but Ivan was still very firm that he had the answers to everything. And then I came to seminary and met Millard. And what he did for me was that he walked lightly over the scriptures itself, and to say, when it says that God said this, that doesn't mean that God said that. That means somebody said what God said. And we began to struggle with that with Millard. And to me, that was an enlightening and a new way of looking at the sacred scriptures. That you don't have to be rigid with all of this. It doesn't have to be literal. And the first course that I had with him was the first 12 chapters of Genesis. And of course, at the end of that study, we didn't see that as a historical event at all, but what it tells how the world works and what happens within this world. And those stories are dramatic stories that give us a way of looking, the way the Hebrew people looked at these things. And it was really, for me, it was so enlightening and so freeing that I could now honestly deal with these scriptures, but not as history, but as story. And the story sometimes really speaks, and sometimes the story was not for me, and I could dismiss it. So, that changed completely my earlier understanding of scriptures. And Millard was, I think, a big stepping stone for me to come to that understanding of our sacred scriptures. So, what I would conclude now, that I didn't hear Millard say this, but I think that a lot of the stories in the Old Testament are stories. And some of the stories are important stories, and some of them carry less importance for us, that they're not all of equal value, that the Bible is not a flat book, that it has its hills and its valleys, and some of the valleys are really wrong. And we need to recognize that.
I think it's really interesting that all of the discussion has been done by men here this morning. I do think it's very interesting, because I would be interested to know how intimately or helpfully the Old Testament often is for women, because women didn't matter and didn't fare very well, and except for Shiphrah and Puah and Ruth and Naomi or whatever, we don't hear much. Most women, if you ask about the Old Testament, say, well, I read the Psalms every day, but the rest of it. So I would welcome to hear from some of the women in the room about what's been important for you. Thank you. That's all I've got. Well, the storytelling, if anything.
Seminary when Millard was still.
I took a class from him, yes. I took Hebrew and I did not do well. By the way, he performed our wedding, which was written by Miriam. I don't know what the I have a whole bunch of stories about them. Yeah, and that she was forgotten at the library. I'm not sure that that was the only place she was forgotten. I just mean that yeah, I'm done.
Ron, did you have a?
I want to say yay and amen to what John Letterock said. I have a note to add to that. I had Millard Linden Seminary during my fundamentalist days, and I cannot count on 2 hands and 2 feet the number of times Millard would stop me and say, Don, come into my office, let's talk. And those conversations shaped how I saw the Bible as Israel telling Israel's story, not God telling Israel's story. There is a difference.
Well, this has been a rich discussion going directions who would have anticipated. I see the time. I wonder if in closing, that paper ends with a critique. Well, it is a critique of the nation state, but the word for today, is there a word for today? Our context?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't have the notes, the version of the paper that I took notes with, and so I'm going a little bit cold here. So I don't have any quick, succinct answer to that.
And Ron might also. Talked about South Africa.
So, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting in what Millard presents here, he presents as an explorer, not a hunter. So that's the first thing that I would say is that I think the counsel that he would give us to that question is an explorer answer, not a hunter answer. And I think it is, he has this sense, both Moses and Jesus rejected the state for an alternative vision, and the rejection of the state is central to biblical faith. I think we are Mennonites of history being conflicted about state power, right? I mean, there was a time when there are still Mennonites who refuse to vote, right? Who feel like that's inappropriate, that participation in the state. And then there are Mennonites, today, many of us are actively trying to influence policy and decision-making in the state. And I think Millard would invite us to take not to do that, not to refrain from that, but to take a step back and to ask ourselves to reflect in an explorer way, not a hunter way, on what is the role of the church in its relationship to the state and its relationship to policy. Again, not that we should refrain from engagement, but that we should reflect a little bit more from that biblical perspective of rejecting the state as an alternative vision. What does that mean for how we engage the state? I think that's an interesting question. So I'll leave with that.
Thank you. Well, just to add, the Mennonite Action Group has made singing their hymns such an important part of their witness. And it connects with your comments, Ron, about the South African hymn you were remembering. They had a mass call this week that said over 700 people were part of it. And it was all about the arts and music in relation to the context we're in today. So